Hi, my name is Julia Barbosa Landois, and I work for Fresh Arts and Arts District Houston. Today, I'm interviewing fellow artist Falon Mihalic, who just completed a new mixed media installation on the facade of Spring Street Studios in the heart of Arts District Houston. Falon is an artist who explores environmental phenomena through site-specific installations, light art, and permanent public art commissions. Her work has been exhibited in galleries and public spaces in Houston and throughout the United States, and has been supported by the Kaboom Foundation, the Houston Mayor's Office of Cultural Affairs, the Houston Arts Alliance, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Center for Spatial Studies at Rice University. Mihalic is also a licensed landscape architect and founder of Falon Land Studio, a landscape architecture and public art firm. Falon, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for the interview. This will be fun.
Can you start off by describing your new work at Spring Street Studios?
Sure. So I was commissioned to address the facade of the Spring Street building, and it spans over 100 feet. That building that is like very centrally located and is positioned right along a really busy hike and bike path. And so we wanted to like really capture, that facade and that view and vantage point from the bike path. And so the piece takes advantage of the existing railing and the existing concrete columns. So there are two material components. One is a type of acrylic that is like painted and fastened onto that railing. And then the other material is a suspended piece up above that takes advantage of the concrete columns. So between each set of columns, there is a painted, really lightweight aluminum mesh. And it's about water flow. So because we have this really long span, I wanted to make that gesture of water flow all the way across. And so the acrylic piece, feels like maybe a kind of stream or spring water that is like flowing across. And then the suspended element feels more like a cloud or like fog or water vapor.
Great. So you're talking about referencing springs. Can you tell us a little bit about the history of the land and water of the area where the piece resides and how that inspired you?
Yeah, absolutely. So Spring Street Studios is on a street called Spring Street. And when you look at the history of, why that might be, it's very close to White Oak Bayou. And so Houston is defined by our bayou systems. And before Houston was, developed, there were springs that just natural springs that bubbled up from the ground and fed the bayous. And there's actually a pretty well-known series of springs that used to exist near the site called Beauchamp Springs. So if you look just across the bayou from where Spring Street is, if you look just north, there's a street called Beauchamp Street. And the elementary school that is there used to be named Beauchamp as well. And that's the name of this entrepreneur or proprietor who was bottling spring water from the groundwater there, bottling spring water from the springs and making a living off of that. And so you can sort of see these kind of remnants of that history in the way that things are named. And I think that's super interesting. Across from the Spring Street building is Sabine Studios, and there's a street called Sabine, which is the Spanish word for cypress. So you can imagine, those swamp cypress trees used to grow all over the landscape where the installation is now. So there's a relationship between spring water and the ecology that it supports, and its relationship to the bayou as a floodplain, what we call a floodplain ecology.
Great. You told us a little bit about the materials that you use, the acrylic and metal mesh. Is some of that reclaimed or recycled material?
So the aluminum mesh is something that I used in a previous temporary project. So I work with temporary projects and permanent commissions, and the spring waters installation, will be up for a year or more. So it's not exactly something that's very permanent. Like it's not going to outlive us the way some of my other art pieces do. And so when I'm doing temporary commissions, I really think about the life cycle of the material. And I'm not going to use something that can't be like remixed and reused later. So the mesh is already on its like second life. And it can be recycled because it's aluminum. It can actually be recycled just at a junkyard. Like it can be dropped off somewhere in Houston to be recycled. So that's key. Like it can't be difficult for a material to be reclaimed or reused or recycled. And then with the acrylic, it is essentially a plastic material, and that can also be recycled, but I will honestly probably cut it into a different geometry and like scrape the paint down and repaint it and reuse it for something else, probably for another temporary commission. So I try to think about, how those materials can be utilized in a way that doesn't send like more material to the landfill. Because, at the end of the day, you're making a piece that has some kind of watershed, some sort of tie to the watershed conceptually, a tie in to the greater world, ecology, environment. And so being responsible about what those materials are in their life cycle is important always, but particularly for the temporary works. Because otherwise you are like producing a whole lot of waste for something that is, on display for a short period of time.
Right. Yeah. It's part of it's the materials of the work, but it's also part of the content and the concept of the work. I like how that all is woven together.
Yeah. And when I use, when I reuse materials and when I talk about like being able to recycle things, it's just important that it's like, you're still able to fully express the concept, and you don't have to like make any kind of compromises just because of the material. You know what I mean? Like you can still fully make that full gesture of like 100 feet all the way across. It still has the color impact that I wanted because color is really important in my work. And so, yeah. It's also more fun because it puts more constraints, right? Because with a temporary piece, like it can be anything. You can use any material. So if you put this kind of constraint that, well, it has to be recyclable or it has to be reusable or something that I'm using from another installation, then it puts a good constraint on the design and creation of the piece.
Yeah, I was thinking about that, and it's an interesting and fun kind of problem solving that you can do as an artist, and also relates to design work. Like if you're going into a certain landscape to do landscape design, like you don't get to choose the attributes of that landscape. Like the water table is the water table, and the native plants are the native plants. So
yeah, absolutely. That is a big thread in my work, how things can be site specific. So like the spring waters piece, for example, that's very specific to that building. Like even if I took those materials and, utilized them as is in a different configuration, it would be a different piece to me. So all of my work operates that way, where it is very specific to the actual place. Yeah. Because places already exist. I don't use that term placemaking much because I prefer that term placekeeping, which means honor it, right? Like on, because a place is there and it exists, just like what you said, you know. So there's a water table, there are cultures, there are languages, there are events and people and things that are already happening. And a really important like first step is to plug in to what is already going on and to respond in a sensitive, like in a context sensitive way. And that's true for landscape architecture and public art in any scenario. I mostly work in the public realm, but I think it's true even in, you know, the private realm, like a home landscape or something. I use those same principles.
So then does your work require a lot of research, and what's your process for gathering information and gathering images and inspiration?
Yeah. Yeah, I do quite a bit of research on, you know, the history and things. It was really fun to read about this Beauchamp entrepreneur, water proprietor. But also I look at maps a lot. It's amazing, you know, the way that, like I was talking about the street names early on, it's like when you dig into what those street names might mean and you start looking at them on a map, this like whole other, you know, layer of history gets revealed. So in terms of keeping track of, you know, images and inspiration, I use sketchbooks a lot. So I keep track of, you know, different ideas and research in hand-drawn format. And then I kind of work through, you know, like for this commission, for the Spring Waters piece, you know, I did hand drawings, and then I did Photoshop renderings, basically of some different ideas, like overlaid onto the facade. And then, you know, developed it from there.
Okay. So your work, your public artwork, your paintings, and kind of performative and site-specific work, and even your work as a landscape architect, it's all guided by an interest in land and ecology. But I'm wondering, I noticed that you have a lot of pieces about water. And so I was wondering, why water specifically?
I don't know that I can give like a super articulate response other than to say that I think water is about a kind of primal force in the living world, and it has so much mystery and beauty in all of its forms. And I'm so fascinated by the way that water and the water cycle, you know, connects all of us to our communities, to plants and animals, and the greater world and ecology around us. So yeah, I think of water as my muse. And, you know, I've been making paintings and sculptures about water for over a decade. And like, I'm not running out of juice, you know, in terms of like the expressive possibilities, in terms of just, you know, like creating these ideas about like, you know, wonder and mystery. Yeah, it's just like it's like not slowing down. So it's like an infinite source of inspiration.
What, so you're talking about inspiration and kind of creating a sense of appreciation and awe. In addition to those things, what do you think, what role do you think that art can play in ecological awareness, or what do you want, what role do you want your art to play in that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it can be answered in lots of ways. It can be answered in as many ways as there are to create art. So I think the relationship between art and ecology, and like how art can fulfill a kind of didactic role or a teaching role, or, you know, raising awareness it's about more than like marketing some idea, or marketing a direct kind of action. And what I think is like the promise of art in this instance, or in this type of scenario, ecologically based art, is that it gives form to the unseen. So it's a way of like making something that is otherwise, subtle, it makes something that's very subtle or ephemeral, like more permanent. And it's this way of like revealing the kind of invisible forces, or like spring waters, revealing and giving form to a more invisible ecological history of the site. And so, right, so it's kind of like it's a way of like making a sculptural map of something that something that is otherwise like kind of just outside our perception, or it's an idea that kind of exists at the edges of our perception, and it sort of like brings it into focus better. So that's what I would say. I think you could ask a lot of artists and they would all have a very different, response.
Yeah, yeah, totally. Well, one other question I had for you is, we're talking about the history of Houston and the land of Houston, but Houston as it is now, the built environment is so expansive. And so I was wondering how you maintain a connection with the land and the non-human world, and these parts of the environment that are your muse, while living in the big city.
Oh yeah. I have a small garden. I have a garden at my studio and a garden at my house. And the studio garden is all containers. But me and my studio mates, we have a praying mantis in our studio garden. I saw a katydid yesterday. We have tiger swallowtail butterflies. So, you can like build a garden that'll attract all of this wildlife. And my garden at my house is like intentionally a bird sanctuary kind of garden, and a medicinal plants garden. So I harvest elderberry, and so my own gardens are like one important way. And then another thing that I do kind of in the city at large is I do collect plants. So there's something called, so like elderberry is a good example. It basically grows like a weed in vacant lots like all over the city. And you can harvest both the flower and the berry. And it's super high in vitamin C, makes this like amazing tea. And it's cool to like, harvest wild plants even in the middle of the city and like use it to make your own tea. I have to tell you though that I like absolutely know what I'm doing, and I don't recommend that anybody just go out and like collect berries or something. Please don't do that. And then another plant that I love collecting in June is the native Texas wild grape. And it makes the most amazing juice. You have to wear gloves to collect it, but because otherwise your hands get this like itchy feeling, because there's something in the skin of the grapes that will make your hands itch. I learned that one time. But yeah, and so yeah, I find like new ways to sort of be on the lookout, right? Because you see the city differently when you're like hunting for plants, or sort of like scouting out like, oh hey, there's like this beautiful elderberry shrub here, I'm gonna harvest that. I found wild blackberries and all of these like different plants that you can totally harvest and eat. So that is something that totally exists outside of any kind of like monetary requirement. It requires like literally just being a flaneur and like wandering around, kind of, being on a bike is the best. So riding a bike around the city and like, finding mulberries and eating them, that is like, that kind of experience is like very special to me. And all of these amazing things that are edible are like, growing. So that's one of the ways that I stay in touch, especially with plants, because I just love plants so much. But what I want to say is that even in a really urban concrete jungle like Houston, like you can find and source all of these things, that have like all of these amazing nourishing qualities. And I think that is like pretty special.
Yeah, and take some of the same skills that I think we apply to being artists, which is just slowing down, being really observant of your environment, and just being curious, right? Like there's an easement in my neighborhood behind a bunch of houses, and I just decided to take a walk there one day, and I found wild onions, and I found the blackberries, and I found these really cool swamp plants in the area where the water doesn't drain. And yeah, you're right. It is everywhere. We just have to sort of be awake to it.
Totally. Yeah, 100%. 100%.
Well, is there anything else you'd like to say to close us out, Falon?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know that I have concluding thoughts. Those were really good questions, and I really appreciate the interest in my work. And thank you to Fresh Arts and the Arts District for commissioning the temporary piece. I had a lot of fun envisioning it, and I had a lot of fun making it and installing it.
And tell us where we can see more of your work.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's all around Houston. But you can check out my website, falonland.com. And my Instagram is at falonland. And that's Falon with one L, LAND.
Great. Thank you so much, Falon.
Thanks, Julia. Talk soon.
Bye.